We have two signatures from Guy Fawkes. The first one, written on November 6, 1605, is controlled, precise, each letter formed with deliberate care. The second one, written just days later, is barely recognizable as handwriting at all, a shaking, jagged scrawl that trails off the page. The name Guido reduced to a few trembling lines that look like they were made by someone who had forgotten how to hold a pen. The space between those two signatures contains one of the most methodical torture programs in English history. The National Archives in London still holds both documents. Archivists who have examined the confession bearing that second signature have noted that the writing is so contorted, so faint, that it serves as physical evidence of something the historical record otherwise obscures: the specific damage inflicted on Fawkes during his 8 days in the Tower of London. His interrogators didn't just break his will, they broke something more fundamental. The man who climbed the scaffold on January 31st, 1606, wasn't the same person who had been discovered in that cellar beneath Parliament 2 months earlier. He was what remained after the Crown finished extracting everything it needed. The execution itself would become one of the most famous in English history, but not because of its spectacular violence. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was designed to be the most horrific punishment the state could devise. A 3-stage process that began with strangulation, progressed to live disembowelment, and ended with the body hacked into pieces for public display across the kingdom. Fawkes was supposed to experience all of it. He was supposed to feel the blade enter his abdomen while his heart still beat. He was supposed to watch his own organs lifted out of his body cavity and burned in a brazier inches from his face. The crowd of thousands who packed into Old Palace Yard that freezing January morning had come specifically to witness this spectacle. They would not get what they expected, because by the time Fawkes reached the scaffold, he had already found a way to cheat them, and the question of whether he did it intentionally has haunted historians for 4 centuries. To understand what happened on that scaffold, we need to go back to the cellar beneath the House of Lords, and to the moment everything fell apart for Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators. The night of November 4th, 1605, was cold. Fawkes had been down in that cramped space for hours, conducting his final check of the 36 barrels of gunpowder stacked against the foundation wall. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. When King James I arrived the following morning to open Parliament, when the entire English government assembled in the chamber directly above his head, the King, the Lords, the Commons, the bishops, the judges, Fawkes would light the fuse and disappear through a back passage into the London streets. By the time anyone understood what had happened, the leadership of Protestant England would be a smoking crater, and Fawkes would be crossing the Channel to the Spanish Netherlands. He never got the chance to light that fuse. Around midnight, a search party led by Sir Thomas Knivett descended into the cellars. They found Fawkes standing among the barrels in a cloak and hat, wearing spurs as if preparing to ride, carrying a dark lantern that could be opened to illuminate his path without revealing his position. Knivett's men searched the room, discovered the gunpowder hidden beneath piles of coal and firewood, and arrested Fawkes on the spot. When asked his name, he gave them the alias he had been using for months: John Johnson. When asked what he was doing in a cellar filled with enough explosives to level a city block, he allegedly replied that he intended to blow the Scots, meaning King James and his Scottish courtiers, back to their own country. The bravado lasted approximately 12 hours. Word of the arrest reached King James before dawn, the monarch who had survived the Gowrie conspiracy just 5 years earlier, who had been raised in the violent cauldron of Scottish court politics, who understood exactly how close he had come to being vaporized along with his entire government. This king did not respond with gratitude for his deliverance. He responded with cold, methodical rage. James drafted the interrogation orders personally, and the language he used tells us something important about what was about to happen. The king's authorization, dated November 6th, instructed the examiners to use the gentler tortures first, and so by degrees proceeding to the worst. This phrasing was not metaphorical. English law at the time prohibited torture except in cases of treason, and even then it required explicit royal authorization. James provided that authorization with precise instructions: start gentle, escalate progressively, extract everything this man knows. Guy Fawkes was taken to the Tower of London that same day. The building that looms over the Thames had served as a royal prison for centuries, and by 1605, its interrogation chambers were equipped with the full apparatus of state-sanctioned agony. The rack stretched victims until their joints separated. The manacles suspended men by their wrists for hours or days, their shoulders slowly dislocating under their own body weight. Fawkes would experience both. The first interrogation session produced nothing useful. Fawkes continued using his alias, continued insisting he acted alone, continued taunting his captors with vague threats about what his co-conspirators might do now that the plot had failed. The examiners reported back to the Privy Council that the prisoner was proving unusually resistant. The council's response was immediate: apply the rack. This is where those two signatures become crucial evidence. On November 6th, before the torture began, Fawkes signed a document using his real name for the first time, an admission that he was not John Johnson, but Guido Fawkes of York. The signature is steady. The letters are distinct. Whatever psychological pressure he was under, his hand remained under his control. The next signature we have comes from a confession dated November 9th. 3 days of the rack had passed. The handwriting is unrecognizable. The name Guido appears as a few shaking strokes that barely form letters at all. The Fawkes that follows is little more than a squiggle trailing toward the bottom of the page. Historians have analyzed these documents extensively, and the consensus is stark. This is what extreme physical trauma looks like when recorded in ink. What exactly did the rack do to Guy Fawkes? The device worked by stretching the human body beyond its structural limits. The victim was laid on a wooden frame with their ankles secured at one end and their wrists tied to rollers at the other. As the interrogators turned the rollers, the body extended. The joints, shoulders, elbows, hips, knees, ankles absorbed increasing tension. Eventually, the ligaments tore, the cartilage separated. In extreme cases, limbs would dislocate entirely, leaving the victim with arms or legs that hung at unnatural angles, permanently damaged. Fawkes endured multiple sessions over approximately 4 days. The physical effects were severe enough that contemporary accounts describe him as unable to walk without assistance by the time his interrogation concluded. His handwriting suggests damage to his arms, shoulders, or hands that affected his fine motor control. And this damage would prove significant on the scaffold, because the man who climbed those ladder-like steps on January 31st was not physically capable of the normal movements expected of a condemned prisoner. Under torture, Fawkes eventually confessed everything. He named his co-conspirators. He described the plot's origins, its financing, its Catholic backers. He revealed the names of the priests who had given the conspirators spiritual comfort, the gentlemen who had provided safe houses, the supporters who had promised men and weapons for the uprising that was supposed to follow the explosion. The confession was comprehensive, damning, and exactly what the Crown needed to justify the crackdown that followed. 13 men would ultimately face trial for the Gunpowder plot. 5 of them, including Robert Catesby, the charismatic leader who had recruited Fawkes for the mission, died in a shootout at Holbeck House on November 8th, when the sheriff's posse caught up with the fleeing conspirators. Catesby took a bullet to the chest and died clutching a picture of the Virgin Mary. His body was later exhumed, decapitated, and his head displayed on a pike outside Parliament, a posthumous execution for a man already beyond the Crown's reach. The 8 surviving conspirators, Fawkes among them, were brought to trial on January 27th, 1606. The proceedings took place in Westminster Hall, the vast medieval chamber that had witnessed the trials of William Wallace and Thomas More. The outcome was never in doubt. The jury convicted all 8 men in a single session. The sentence: hanging, drawing, and quartering, the punishment reserved for the most serious form of treason. We need to understand exactly what this sentence meant, because modern descriptions often gloss over the specific mechanics of what the condemned were about to experience. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was not simply execution, it was a carefully choreographed demonstration of royal power designed to inflict maximum suffering while providing maximum spectacle. The punishment consisted of 3 distinct phases, each with its own terrible purpose. The first phase was hanging, but not the long drop hanging that would later become standard, the kind that snaps the neck and causes near instantaneous death. This was short drop hanging, designed to strangle the victim slowly while keeping them conscious. The condemned would be suspended by a noose, their feet dangling above the platform, experiencing the crushing pressure on their windpipe and carotid arteries. The sensation is one of extreme panic as the body's oxygen supply diminishes, but death refuses to arrive. Victims of short drop hanging can remain conscious for several minutes, their faces turning purple, their legs kicking involuntarily, their bound hands clawing at nothing. The key detail: the victim was cut down before death. The hanging was not meant to kill, it was meant to weaken, to terrorize, to reduce the condemned to a gasping, disoriented state in which they could no longer resist what came next. The second phase was drawing, the disembowelment. While the victim was still alive, still conscious if the executioner had calibrated the hanging correctly, their genitals were cut off and burned before their eyes. Then, the abdomen was opened with a knife. The executioner reached inside the body cavity and removed the intestines, the stomach, the kidneys, pulling them out loop by loop while the victim watched. The organs were thrown into a fire or brazier positioned nearby. Contemporary accounts suggest that victims sometimes survived well into this process, their nervous systems still transmitting signals as their internal organs were removed. Death typically came from blood loss or shock, but the exact moment varied. The third phase was quartering. Once the victim was finally dead, the body was decapitated and then hacked into 4 pieces, the quarters that gave the punishment its name. These body parts would be parboiled in a mixture of salt and cumin to preserve them, then dipped in tar, and finally distributed to different cities across the kingdom for public display. The head usually went to London Bridge, where it would be mounted on a spike above the stone gateway, a permanent reminder of the cost of treason. This was what awaited Guy Fawkes on the morning of January 31st, 1606. The executions were split across 2 days in 2 different locations, and this division tells us something about how the government wanted the spectacle managed. On January 30th, 4 conspirators died at St. Paul's Churchyard, in the heart of London: Sir Everard Digby, Robert Wintour, John Grant, and Thomas Bates. Digby, the wealthy gentleman who had hosted the conspirators at his country estate, reportedly cried out, "O Christ," as his intestines were removed. Bates, a servant who had been recruited by his master, made a brief speech asking forgiveness. Grant and Wintour died with less recorded commentary. The crowd that gathered to watch numbered in the thousands, and contemporary accounts describe the atmosphere as almost festive. Vendors selling food and drink, spectators jostling for better views, children hoisted onto shoulders to see the scaffold. The next day, January 31st, the remaining 4 conspirators were brought to Old Palace Yard, Westminster, directly across from the Houses of Parliament that they had attempted to destroy. This location was chosen with deliberate symbolism. Ambrose Rookwood, Thomas Wintour, Robert Keyes, and Guy Fawkes would die within sight of the building whose destruction had been their life's purpose. They would be executed in order of perceived guilt, with Fawkes, the man who had been caught red-handed with the gunpowder, saved for last. What happened at Old Palace Yard that morning reveals something important about the unpredictable nature of these executions. Not all 4 men experienced the same fate, and the differences between their deaths are significant. Ambrose Rookwood went first. He was a young gentleman, well-educated and well-liked, who had been drawn into the conspiracy through a combination of religious conviction and personal loyalty to Robert Catesby. On the scaffold, he made a brief speech acknowledging his guilt, then climbed the ladder to the gallows. When the executioner pushed him off, Rookwood did something clever. He jumped. By throwing himself from the ladder with force, rather than simply dropping, he generated enough momentum that the fall snapped his neck almost instantly. He was dead before the executioner could cut him down for disembowelment. This was not supposed to happen. The short drop hanging was specifically designed to prevent this outcome. Rookwood had essentially cheated the punishment, dying quickly from a broken neck rather than slowly from strangulation, and thereby escaping the conscious experience of being disemboweled. His body was still quartered and displayed, but the worst of his suffering was over in seconds. Thomas Wintour followed. The brother of one of the men executed the previous day. He had been a key planner of the plot, traveling to Spain to seek support for the Catholic cause before the conspiracy coalesced around the Gunpowder scheme. His execution proceeded more according to plan. He was hanged, cut down while still alive, and disemboweled. The contemporary accounts do not record his final moments in detail, which suggests they were unremarkable by the standards of the day, meaning he likely died during the disembowelment phase from shock or blood loss without causing a scene. Robert Keyes attempted to replicate Rookwood's trick. He was a tall man, physically imposing, and he understood what Rookwood had achieved by jumping from the ladder. When his turn came, Keyes threw himself off with considerable force. His rope broke. He crashed to the scaffold platform, injured but very much alive. The executioner and his assistants grabbed him before he could move, dragged him to the block, and proceeded with the disembowelment while he was fully conscious and completely aware of what was happening to him. There was no preliminary hanging at all, just the knife and the fire and the slow extraction of his organs while he screamed. Keyes experienced the full horror of the punishment exactly as it was designed. Contemporary observers noted that his death was particularly prolonged and particularly terrible. He had tried to find the same escape that Rookwood discovered, and his attempt had backfired catastrophically. And then came Guy Fawkes, the final conspirator, the man whose name would become synonymous with the plot itself. A contemporary account describes what the crowd saw. Last of all came the great devil of all, Guy Fawkes, alias Johnson, who should have put fire to the powder. His body being weak with the torture and sickness, he was scarce able to go up the ladder, yet with much ado, by the help of the hangman, went high enough to break his neck by the fall. He made no speech, but with his crosses and idle ceremonies made his end upon the gallows and the block, to the great joy of all the beholders that the land was ended of so wicked a villainy. This account captures the critical detail. Fawkes's body was so damaged from the torture that he could barely climb the ladder. The rack had done its work too well. His arms, shoulders, or legs, possibly all three, were compromised to the point where the simple act of ascending a short staircase required assistance from the executioner. The man who had once been strong enough to guard 36 barrels of gunpowder through a long winter night could no longer walk unaided. The question that historians have debated ever since: did Fawkes deliberately replicate Rookwood's jump, consciously choosing to break his own neck rather than face disembowelment? Or did his damaged body simply fail him? Did he fall because he lacked the strength to stand, the push of the executioner sending him off the ladder with more force than intended, the fall becoming fatal through pure accident? The contemporary account suggests he went high enough to break his neck by the fall. This phrasing implies that Fawkes climbed as high as he could manage, then dropped. Whether this was intentional or involuntary, the result was the same. His neck snapped on impact. Like Rookwood, he cheated the disembowelment. Unlike Keyes, his attempt succeeded. The crowd had come to watch a spectacle of suffering. They had expected to see the man who nearly destroyed their government experience the full measure of state vengeance. Instead, they watched a broken figure struggle up a ladder and die in seconds. The torture that had extracted Fawkes's confession had also stolen the Crown's ability to fully punish him. The rack gave the government everything it wanted to know, but it took away the climactic execution that would have served as the ultimate demonstration of royal power. Fawkes's death did not end his usefulness to the state. His body was still quartered, his head still removed. The skull was mounted on a spike at London Bridge, joining the other traitors' heads that had accumulated there over the centuries. A keeper of the heads maintained this macabre display, replacing rotted specimens and repositioning skulls as needed. The heads were treated with tar to slow decomposition, though this process also disfigured them beyond easy recognition. The other body parts, the 4 quarters, were parboiled and distributed to different cities across the kingdom. The purpose was deterrence. Every major population center would have a physical reminder of what awaited those who challenged royal authority. A man could be walking through York or Bristol or Newcastle and encounter a rotting limb mounted above a gateway, a fragment of someone who had dared to imagine a different England. This display system remained in use until the 1660s in some locations, with heads visible on London Bridge into the 1770s. The last recorded gunpowder plot remains were removed within a few decades of the execution, though the exact dates are uncertain. What is certain is that Guy Fawkes' body, like those of his co-conspirators, was treated not as the remains of a human being, but as raw material for political messaging, a propaganda campaign conducted in flesh and bone. The executions did not end with the 8 lay conspirators. The government had a larger target, the Catholic Church itself, or at least its English representatives. Father Henry Garnet was a Jesuit priest who had heard confessions from several of the conspirators before the plot was discovered. He had not participated in the planning, had not provided material support, had arguably tried to discourage the violence through indirect means. His crime was knowledge. He knew what was coming and did not report it to the authorities. Under English law, this made him guilty of misprision of treason at minimum. Garnet was executed on May 3, 1606, at St. Paul's Churchyard. His case had become a cause célèbre among Catholics, both in England and on the continent, and by the time he reached the scaffold, public opinion had shifted in unexpected ways. When the hangman cut him down for disembowelment, following the standard procedure, something remarkable happened. The crowd intervened. Spectators surged forward and grabbed Garnet's legs, pulling downward with their combined weight. They were trying to hasten his death, to snap his neck before the executioner could proceed with the knife. The intervention worked. Garnet died from the hanging itself, his neck broken by the crowd's assistance, and the disembowelment was performed on a corpse rather than a living man. This was an act of collective mercy from the same London populace that had cheered the deaths of the lay conspirators 4 months earlier. The crowd had decided that Garnet's punishment was unjust, that a priest who had heard a confession and kept it secret did not deserve to be disemboweled while conscious. They could not save him from death, but they could save him from the worst of the dying. The specific horrors of hanging, drawing, and quartering invite a clinical examination. What exactly happens to the human body during each phase? The medical literature on this subject is grim but instructive. During short drop hanging, the noose compresses the carotid arteries and jugular veins, restricting blood flow to and from the brain. Simultaneously, the windpipe is crushed, preventing respiration. The victim experiences intense pressure in the head as venous blood backs up, the face becoming engorged and discolored. Consciousness typically persists for 30 seconds to 2 minutes, during which the victim experiences extreme air hunger, the desperate, involuntary urge to breathe that cannot be satisfied. The kicking and struggling observed in hanging victims is partly voluntary and partly the result of neurological reflexes as the brain begins to fail. If the victim survives this phase and is cut down, they would be in a state of extreme physical distress, oxygen deprived, disoriented, possibly with damage to the structures of the throat that would make breathing painful even after the noose was removed. This was the condition in which prisoners were meant to face disembowelment. The abdominal incision that began the disembowelment would initially cause severe pain as the blade cut through skin, fat, and muscle. Once the peritoneum, the membrane lining the abdominal cavity, was breached, the pain would intensify. The intestines themselves have relatively few pain receptors, but the mesentery that attaches them to the body wall is extremely sensitive. As the executioner pulled out loops of intestine, the mesentery would be stretched and torn, producing waves of agony. Blood loss during this process would be substantial, but not necessarily immediately fatal. The major blood vessels, the aorta, the vena cava, are located near the spine, and a skilled executioner could remove the intestines without severing them. Death would come from shock, from the collapse of blood pressure as the body attempted to respond to catastrophic trauma, or eventually from blood loss as smaller vessels were torn during the organ removal. The burning of the genitals and organs before the victim's eyes added a psychological dimension to the physical torture. Assuming the victim was still conscious at this point, they would be watching pieces of themselves consumed by fire while experiencing the ongoing physical destruction of their body. The total sensory overload, the pain, the visual horror, the smell of their own burning flesh, was designed to annihilate the victim psychologically, even as it destroyed them physically. Guy Fawkes became the face of the Gunpowder plot, but he was never its leader. That role belonged to Robert Catesby, a charismatic Catholic gentleman who had conceived the entire scheme and recruited the men who would carry it out. Catesby was the true believer, the driving force, the man whose vision had nearly changed the course of English history. Catesby never stood trial. He never faced the scaffold. When the sheriff's posse surrounded Holbeck House on November 8, 1605, Catesby chose to fight rather than surrender. He emerged from the building with his sword drawn, alongside Thomas Percy, another conspirator. Both men were cut down by gunfire within moments. Some accounts say by a single shot that passed through both of them. Catesby died clutching an image of the Virgin Mary. His last act a gesture of the faith that had driven him to attempt mass murder. The government was furious. Catesby's death robbed them of the opportunity to interrogate the plot's mastermind, to extract whatever additional information he might have possessed, to make an example of him on the scaffold. They settled for the next best thing: posthumous execution. Catesby's body was exhumed, decapitated, and his head mounted on a pike outside Parliament. He would join his co-conspirators in death, even if he had escaped them in dying. The story of Guy Fawkes should end with that skull on London Bridge, with the quartered remains distributed across England, with the annual celebration that would soon follow, Bonfire Night, November 5th, when effigies of Fawkes would burn across the kingdom in commemoration of the plot's failure. The immediate political consequences were severe for English Catholics. The penal laws tightened, recusancy fines, the penalties for refusing to attend Anglican services increased. Catholics were barred from practicing law, from holding public office, from voting. The brief hope of toleration that some Catholics had placed in King James, himself the son of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, evaporated entirely. The government used the plot to justify decades of persecution, pointing to the gunpowder beneath Parliament whenever anyone questioned whether Catholics could be trusted with civil liberties. Fawkes himself underwent a strange transformation over the centuries that followed. The villain of 1605 became gradually something else entirely. By the Victorian era, Guy had become slang for any oddly dressed person, derived from the grotesque effigies burned on November 5th. In the 20th century, Fawkes began to be reinterpreted as a folk hero, the man who had dared to challenge an unjust government, who had nearly succeeded in a spectacular act of resistance. The Guy Fawkes mask, popularized by a graphic novel and later a film, became a symbol of anonymous protest movements worldwide. There is something deeply ironic about this transformation. Fawkes was not a freedom fighter. He was not attempting to liberate the English people from tyranny. He was trying to install a Catholic monarchy by murdering hundreds of people, including civilians who simply happened to be present when Parliament opened. His cause was not liberty, but religious conformity under a different banner. The man whose face now represents resistance to authoritarian power was himself an agent of authoritarianism, just a different authoritarianism than the one that happened to hold power in 1605. The execution of Guy Fawkes was designed to be a spectacle of state power, a demonstration that treason would be met with suffering beyond ordinary imagination. In this, it partially failed. The torture that broke Fawkes's body also broke the Crown's ability to punish him fully. The man who climbed that scaffold on January 31st, 1606, was already destroyed, his spirit extracted through days on the rack, his physical capacity so diminished that he could barely walk. When he fell from the ladder and broke his neck, he cheated the disembowelment that was supposed to be the centerpiece of his death. Robert Keyes was not so fortunate. His attempt to replicate the trick ended with a broken rope and a fully conscious disembowelment. He experienced the punishment exactly as it was intended, and contemporary accounts suggest his death was prolonged and terrible beyond easy description. This contrast between Fawkes's almost accidental mercy and Keyes's complete horror captures something essential about these executions. They were not precise instruments. They were crude demonstrations of power in which chance played an enormous role. A stronger rope, a weaker jump, a more vigorous hangman. Any of these could have changed who suffered and who escaped. The men who died at Westminster on that freezing January morning were subjects of the same sentence, but they experienced radically different deaths. And perhaps that randomness was part of the point. The terror of hanging, drawing, and quartering lay not just in its planned horrors, but in its unpredictability. You could not know, climbing that ladder, whether you would find a quick death or a slow one. You could not know whether the crowd would help you or watch you suffer. The only certainty was that your body would be destroyed, your remains scattered, your memory cursed for generations. For Guy Fawkes, the curse eventually became something else. His name outlived the men who killed him. His image outlived the kingdom that condemned him. The plot failed, but the plotter achieved a strange immortality, remembered not as he was, but as later generations needed him to be. The tortured man who scrawled his broken signature on a confession, who could barely climb a ladder on the morning of his death, who fell into darkness with the snap of his neck. He became a symbol for things he never believed and causes he would have despised. The body was destroyed, the legend survived.